With the royal wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, British monarchy is front and centre in public conversation, with some groups using the opportunity to forward their arguments for an end to monarchy and an adoption of republicanism. This isn't a new idea for England, and in fact between 1649 and 1660, England was ruled as a republic after the Second Civil War and the execution of Charles I. However, this experiment ended with the invitation from Parliament for Charles II to take the throne in 1660 in what is known today as the Restoration. I spoke to University of Plymouth history professor and expert in early modern European history, Dr. Jameson Tucker, to explore how England became a republic, how it functioned, and why it eventually abandoned the experiment and returned to monarchy. Right, so your name is Dr. Jameson Tucker,
Yep.
And you're a lecturer in early modern European history, 1500s to 1700s, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
What we're talking about today is why England abandoned its 10-year experiment with republicanism and returned to monarchy. So a sort of opening question would be, the reasoning behind why England actually became a republic. What was the politics, what was going on at the time that actually triggered the event?
Well, right up until the execution of the king and the decision not to replace him with another king, these were clearly very contingent decisions. Cromwell himself was not sold on the rationale for getting rid of a king. He wanted a king perhaps he could control, or a king who would follow the sorts of policies he wanted. But the number of people who genuinely wanted a republic was a small proportion, it seems, of the Parliament. They sort of talked themselves into it, and Charles proved himself to be more dangerous, to some degree, alive than dead, and that contributed to it. The number of people who set out to achieve a republic, even in the year, say, before it happened, would have been a very small proportion of those in Parliament, and a very small one, indeed, of those in the country at large. There was some precedent. Classics are a major subject of study, and the overthrow of the Roman kings and replacement by the Roman Republic, in many ways is actually a dog that didn't bark. A lot of people would have read about it, but it doesn't come up as often as you might expect in their writings. There aren't so many comparisons. They don't use the word republic much, for example. They do say commonwealth an awful lot more. So I think it's a very complicated, slightly confused situation.
With that point, because obviously we, in modern politics, the idea of a republic has different meanings to different people depending on where you are in the world. Obviously, America, they have a concept of republic different than a French concept. The Commonwealth concept, though, how were they defining that as a principle, as opposed to what we now consider a Commonwealth and what we've got with the monarch?
The group that end up being known as the Commonwealth men, sort of all one word, tend to be the people who put the Parliament as the supreme entity, the final sovereign body in this new look. And for the first couple of years after the execution of Charles, it is the Parliament above all that has the upper hand. So very quickly that becomes sort of their signature organization, their signature constitutional move is that Parliament above all, rather than a Lord Protector or a Council of State or an alternative king. So Commonwealth to them would seem to be that idea. Commonwealth, again, can be a term for almost any sort of political organization, depending on how you look at it in this period. But the Commonwealth men and people who stand up for that are parliamentary supremacists above all, it would seem.
And discussing these particular people who are espousing these new, for the time, new principles and philosophies, what were these, who were these people? Where was their philosophical grounding? Because as you've already said, the Roman republics weren't really a thing they were drawing from. Where were they finding their roots?
Well, there's the people who actually intend for some sort of new political system are, as I say, a minority, and Cromwell really probably can't be counted amongst them. He's pretty politically conservative himself. And so we're talking about groups like the Levellers, above all, who are largely based in London and the southeast. They're interested in a number of things. A lot of it is biblical in nature, or at least religious in nature. The old ideas of the equality of man, readings from the Bible, readings back to the Garden of Eden and things like that come up, particularly in the more religious people. And there's this outpouring of all sorts of religious groups and sects at this point. Given that Charles I in particular had identified himself with the Anglican Church, a lot of them see the freedom of religion that they've been fighting for as synonymous with a political freedom as well, that the two are tied. Cromwell is interesting there because he does want an awful lot more religious freedom, perhaps not as much as the Quakers want, for example, but quite a bit. But he wants to achieve it through fairly conventional or conservative means, which is the reason why it's so hard to put your finger on a lot of what he does in this period. So no, the levelers are, and an outgrowth of them, the diggers, who are, put these things actually into practice and sort of found a type of, I think, a commune just in a small area of Surrey, but very quickly dispersed by the authorities. And so they very clearly are religiously inspired. No, the Roman Republic comes into it, so do some of the ideas, constitutional and historical ideas, come over from France. They're not the same ones that the French use, but in the 1580s and the late 1570s in France in the Civil Wars, it becomes clear that a Protestant is the next man in line for the French throne. And 90-80% of the population of France are Catholics, and many of them are worried about that. And so a debate starts as to where legitimacy comes from. Do you have to be, is it more important that it be the rightful heir to the throne, or more important that it be a Catholic? And some people answer this through reference to history, going way back to the 500s and 600s, and looking at how France was first governed. And that idea of precedent and the idea that even the right of kings is subject to control and to override has been really abundantly proved in France in those civil wars. And that idea that there are simply natural laws or historical laws governing the legitimacy even of a monarch is in the mix as well.
We see that reflected in ancient English history, where the kings under the Anglo-Saxon dynasty the Wessex dynasty was subject to the Witan, and that a king would require the assent of his lords, and we see a sort of return of that with Parliament asserting themselves over Charles I, ultimately breaking down into war between the king and the lords. We see a similar issue arise with Cromwell, where he is aggravated by the slow movement of the bare bones Parliament, and famously marches in and declares that they are no Parliament, disbands them with military force, and sets up his generals with his regions under control of effectively military dictatorship. We see that appear as a common thread in a number of republics through history. We have Napoleon effectively seizing control. We have Julius Caesar becoming an emperor in Rome, refusing to surrender his wartime authority. This seems to be a thing that we get a lot with republics, and we see it again with Cromwell. What do you think is causing that? What is there a structural flaw in the philosophy, or is it something that has been dealt with, do you think, now more to a degree?
I certainly don't think it's been dealt with, and I think it's not much more likely actually to happen than in a monarchy. But when an armed leader seizes power in a monarchy and puts himself at the head of it, it just looks like a change of kings, your Norman conquests, your glorious revolutions, and it doesn't entail a change in constitution, and so we don't notice it as easily or as often.
They suffer perhaps from setting themselves a higher, more noble goal, and being seen to fall flat, maybe. Hypocrisy is more apparent.
And it's more clear that the government that exists under this new strongman is different from the government that existed under the Republic, which isn't always the case. The other thing, of course, is that new republics are vulnerable, more vulnerable, because there has to be some source of legitimacy. It can be armed power, of course. It can be long-standing institutions that serve an effective purpose for people, or it can be a generalized agreement that there is some sort of legitimacy, whether it's because it's been elected, because it's always existed, like long-standing antiquity, or just even tradition. But something like the bare bones Parliament, which of course is debatable, and I think pretty unlikely that Cromwell set it up to be a parliament. It was more of a constitutional convention that later, after it had met, called itself a parliament, that would have commanded that same sort of respect. And that's what we see towards the end of the Commonwealth period, when the rump is called back. They have a parliament sitting, the Third Protectorate Parliament, and that doesn't hold enough legitimacy. The people who making the final decisions end up being the rump, and, well, an expanded rump, kind of the remains of the Long Parliament, almost 20 years old. That, for whatever reason, 20 years on, still has a legitimacy. It might be a democratic legitimacy, certainly it's an institutional one, that even the much more recent Third Protectorate Parliament simply doesn't have. And at the end of the day, when the other institutions fail, it's the rump that gets brought back to finalize things.
There's the interesting quirk that I think is more specific to English law that we see, which is Parliament attempts to make Cromwell a king.
Mm-hmm.
Because under the English common law practices, there were set limits on what a king could do. It was in fact those very limits that they breached, that was breached by Charles I, that brought civil war.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that that's uniquely something that we see in English law, or is that something that appears in other places? And why was it so important to try and put that title of king on it?
Well, I guess there's two separate things there. One is that we do see this sort of behavior elsewhere, the idea that there are limits on kings. Absolutely. The debate that comes in the 1570s and 80s in France at the time of the Civil Wars is explicitly about the limits of the king to choose his own successor, to pass certain laws about heresy, and even whether the king can or should overrule the nobles. There's this idea that, amongst some thinkers, that effectively the kingdom is organic, and that the nobility and the princes of the blood and the estates general all have God-given legitimacy, and the king can't get rid of these institutions. That the nobles have an absolute right to be consulted, and the princes of the blood can sit, and these are close relatives of the king basically, can and must sit in the council, whether he wants them in the council or not. So there is this constitutional scaffolding. And what's interesting is that different thinkers come of different ways of showing how this happened and why it's important, but they all agree on those basic points. What are the limits to the king's power is a very long-standing question there. Obviously, we've been seeing it through the Middle Ages in the great battles between the Church and the Holy Roman Emperors. So no, I don't think England's particularly unique on that point. The Parliament has more teeth, is more regularly meeting. Estates General in France are rare beasts indeed, and quite difficult to pull together, but they are democratic-ish, and they have mandates to solve certain issues. So it's a cause of a great deal of fighting in France in that period. As to whether the crown being turned down by Cromwell is in any way an issue, I think there's a couple really interesting questions there. One is that the crown, as offered to him, came within this framework of a new constitution being proposed. Whether he might have accepted it if it had come with different powers and different conditions on it, I don't know, and that would be an interesting question. He might have turned it down simply because it was the wrong time and the wrong sort of offer. There does seem to be a sense, and we don't have a lot of access, I don't believe, to Cromwell's thinking on this, that he was concerned that it would look bad and it would be a dangerous precedent to set. For all that, he was happy to make the protectorate hereditary, quasi-hereditary. It wasn't hereditary as a principle, but he seems to have passed it on to his son. But we don't have proof for that.
Yeah, it looks sort of like his son was pressed into it, because there seemed a lot of reluctance on his son's part. I think he only sat for 290 odd days and was very willing to hand over when Monk entered Parliament and made the call for the king to return from exile.
There is, though, a suggestion that Cromwell nominated Fleetwood to take over on paper, which paper was destroyed by Fleetwood's rivals. We have no written evidence that he did nominate Richard. That's a slight conspiracy theory element to that, but people like John Morrill, who's about as big an authority as you'd like, says that there's the possibility of truth in that. So we can't put too much store by that succession because we really don't know what happened.
Like Fleetwood was quite an important figure for most of Cromwell's time.
Yep.
So
Older, more trusted. Better relations with the army, and the lack of relations with the army is what in the end did for Richard, who just didn't command their authority. He was already effectively sidelined not by Monk but by the members of the New Model Army in London, who certainly convinced him to resign and may well have had him under house arrest before that.
Yeah. There is a strong thread throughout what I've read on it, and what seems to be suggested is that while it's been called a Commonwealth, been called a Republic, the New Model Army's very overwhelming influence on Parliament and on successive leaders suggests that there's more of a militaristic sort of, I hesitate to use the word dictatorship, but more of a militaristic government than there was actually a Commonwealth or a framework. What do you think about that?
There's a lot to that. Certainly the period of the Majors General is a military dictatorship by any definition. The periods before that, it's difficult to say if it's very different from when new democracies occasionally have the military step in to shake off this or that strongman, who holds the democratic power there. Because if they are stepping in to remove this or that faction and then handing power back to the Parliament, that's a fairly familiar pattern from the 20th century, for example. What is clear, though, is in the absence of any other sort of legitimacy, they at least have power. And there's simply no other organization out there that can make a decision in some instances. The only other group with any legitimacy are the Long Parliament or the rump thereof.
I mean, they're drawing their legitimacy from being the last elected Parliament before the collapse of Charles, arguably very shaky. And there is the old adage that all authority derives from force.
Mm-hmm.
So you could argue that is how they're able to establish themselves. Cromwell passes away, his son succeeds. We see very quickly after that, within the space of a year, this Commonwealth project comes apart.
Mm-hmm.
We see invitations for the king to return. We see Charles II comes, invited, coronated. What do you think was the fatal underpinnings that saw the Commonwealth come apart? Was it just that it was without Cromwell, the strongman character that they needed for the initial years went away? Was it a fundamental flaw with their philosophical groundings? Was it a lack of a written constitution with a solid framework set up? What was it?
I think it's probably an error to think of the Commonwealth period as a single period. What we have are 3 or 4 constitutional arrangements in the space of about a dozen years. In most cases, with Cromwell there as a backstop, we tend to ignore them because they all end up with Cromwell in some position of power. Without Cromwell there, they're once again, for the 3rd or 4th or 5th time, casting about for a new set of arrangements. But without a reliable figure there, it goes in a different direction. So we have this period of parliamentary supremacy under the rump. Very quickly we move on to the bare-bones parliament. Very quickly after that, the major generals and the protectorate, and then this period where he's offered the crown under yet another constitution, this letter. And so Cromwell dies, and that's fine. There's continuity for a while, until, not through any flaw of the systems, but a flaw of the personnel. Richard Cromwell's lack of support undermines that as well. So they cast about for yet another way forward. The army in London has him removed. He resigns, whichever way you like to look at it. And infighting in that group eventually leads to the recall of the rump. But that's just, again, the obvious place to look for legitimacy to pick yet another way forward. It's only when they're assembled that there's any real chance of the king being recalled. I don't think that was the idea when they got rid of Richard. It probably wasn't even the idea when they called the rump up. But most of the people at the time of the initial parliament were royalists. They were royalists even after the death of Charles I, a lot of them, at least subtly or quietly. And there weren't a lot of other options. The rump could have continued to sit as it had done in the early 50s as the main organization, but without Cromwell about, there are fewer things to change it to. Fleetwood could well have managed it. It's unclear. Some of the other people around Cromwell, again, Ireton could maybe, if he hadn't died, could maybe have handled a protectorate type situation. But when they decided Richard couldn't, they got rid of the institution rather than putting someone else into it.
Yeah. The suggestions from some of the writings that you see that there was a strong, I don't want to say, buyer's remorse at having killed the king. His reluctance to surrender after his surrender and then attempting to fight again. They feel it's maybe a necessity at the time, but you start to see that there's a lot of reluctance or buyer's remorse for having got rid of the king. And we still see that there are quite a number of royalists that continue to return to Parliament over these, these changing things. You think that it was less a last-ditch return, or it was an internal politic and that they'd wanted to bring back a king, and that now with Cromwell gone and the military's sort of ability to wield as much power as it had, there was a good opportunity there for them to actually bring back a monarch?
Framing it that way makes it sound like this was some sort of long-standing plot or design. And I think it's just a situation where you've got a group of people who a decade ago thought the monarchy was a good thing if in need of some control, who, when presented with a power vacuum and asked, how do you want to fill it, still hold that belief. If the issue hadn't come up, if we hadn't had that power vacuum, I'm not sure if they ever would have acted on it or done something about it. But if you take a group of people who, as you say, might have buyer's remorse and ask them, well, what do you want out of this situation? And the Parliament here is key, as much or more so than the military in making these offers. The military had put the Parliament back in. There are a lot of people who can't see a better option out there, certainly. And figures like Monk, who's a very ambivalent figure, are curious there. The king had been writing to him for years, asking for his help. Clearly he saw something in Monk that he thought was likely to help him, but Monk played it all with a very straight bat, sent the letters on to Cromwell, didn't refuse to help, but just blanked him, effectively. And most of the major events happen before Monk actually makes it back to London. He's the looming threat, but he doesn't actually have to do as much as we sometimes credit him with, because just the fact of his existence does a lot of the... it focuses minds, which means that we never find out what he would have done had he had to. So there's a lot of question marks about that, but they don't even hold out for tying Charles to a constitution, for example, which is strongly discussed. Let's remake the monarchy and give the king these limits. In the end, they don't even go that far. They just sort of stumble over each other.
He also, Charles II gets it. He makes a quite busy time of it, hunting down those who had conspired against his father. Obviously that was beyond the scope of what I read, but I had a bit of a glimpse into it. He was quite adamant about finding these people and getting rid of them. So it wasn't like he was this new and fresh monarch that was open and free. He still kept some of this authoritarian edge to him. But there seems to be some concessions made in some ways. The legacy of the Republic has had some effect, because Parliament has really asserted its authority over a king previously, and we don't see him attempt to overstep it to huge degrees ever again.
Well, but there is a lot of discussion of, do we put limits on Charles before he arrives? And they basically just run out of time. They are interested in doing it. Now, a point to make about Charles hunting down the regicides is, in many ways, it is the least that he can do. The act of forgetting there, which is a very powerful thing for ending wars of religion in continental Europe, is fulfilled to a large degree by Charles, to a degree that probably the people who feared him couldn't have hoped for. In 1652, the Commonwealth regime, Cromwellian regime, passes an act, again, effectively of forgetting, let bygones be bygones, and former royalists, having paid a fine, can now live out their lives normally. Under the major generals, they renege on that, and former royalists are now due to pay an extra tax to pay for the major generals. And that's thousands of people, I believe, and some of the most influential people who, having been told that the war is over and they've made peace, are now being dragged back in. There's certainly nothing on that scale by Charles. He has a named list of a certain number of names, and if you're not one of those people, you can rest pretty easy. And he holds to that. He doesn't do what Cromwell does and renege on that peacemaking, that forgetting. And so that's it's wise politics, really, on his point, but it does mean that the hunting down of the regicides is relatively speaking well contained. You know whether you are one or not. There's a list, and if you're not one of them, you're on pretty safe ground.
What do you think the legacy is of this political upheaval? You know, the different thinkers you got, the diggers, the levelers that you discussed, the different sects which Cromwell did come after a couple of them for various reasons. We see borne out in less than 100 years later, we've got people like Locke. Mm-hmm. We've had Thomas Hobbes. We start to see this sort of growth of a liberal movement. How much of that has any roots in what came before? What is the legacy of the Commonwealth?
It's probably mainly rhetorical, to be honest, that people can point at it and say things can be different. What it means is very contested. And I think there's a strong religious element, because they don't ever manage to put the sects back in the bottle. And several the bulk of the more successful ones grow up in exactly this period. You get your Quakers and your Baptists who never go away, although the Muggletonians or the Ranters don't last very long.
The Muggletonians, I'm not heard of them.
Oh, they're led by a guy called Muggleton, Thomas Muggleton, I think. They're fairly standard sort of street preaching, end of the world type.
The end is no chance.
Yeah, I don't think they're quite as apocalyptic as some. You've got your Fifth Kingdom types, Fifth Monarchists, for example. But the name catches people's attention. Certainly, there's the Adamites who believe in going back to Genesis, which means preaching in the streets of London naked. There's all sorts that grow out of it, but some groups like the Quakers do last, obviously, and that the religious freedom granted to them is never entirely scaled back. So that's a long-standing thing. In terms of thought, I guess later thinkers probably do draw on it as inspiration, but I don't know if there are any specific institutions that arise from it that themselves are directly influential. I mean, the most influential thinker who comes out of this period is probably the most authoritarian in Hobbes.
Leviathan's a bit of a scary book in places.
And it's a book terrified of a power vacuum. It's a book that, above all, mandates strong central government, doesn't it?
Yeah, as inherently evil requires a strong man figure, yeah.
So the thinkers of a century later maybe can draw on it for ideas or images that appeal to them, and certainly radical reformers, people pushing for radical democracy, make a real fetish of groups like the Levelers. The Putney debates, for example, get re-litigated almost every generation. What were they for? What did they mean? And does that mean that the Civil War was, in fact, more radical than we thought? Cromwell becomes, in the late 19th century and 20th century, a Whiggish figure, fighting for the rights of Parliament, fighting for the rights of the rule of law against a fairly tyrannical king. But that suits the mood of the moment as much as anything.
We see, as you previously mentioned earlier on, we see another revolution in England, Glorious Revolution they call it. We don't see the same thing we saw previously.
Yeah.
We see a monarch coming to terms with a parliament. We see willingly accepting limitations placed upon him that previously Charles I had thoroughly resisted.
Yeah.
And it's effectively it's the sort of the birth of modern monarchy in this country. Most of the limitations we have on our Queen now drew from that time. How influential do you think what came before was in creating this atmosphere where it seemed all sides were interested in making sure that there was a new format with a monarch as opposed to removing them?
It's certainly very influential. I don't know if it's the reason why they don't remove the monarch. I'm not sure how many people that occurred to be honest. But it's certainly very influential in terms of setting up a system where there are limits that must be enforced, that the monarchy are effectively on some sort of leash that can be tightened up. There's, as I mentioned with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in France in 1685, a lot of this is driven by fears about Catholic power, and that's a big reason why William accepts and comes over, because he is fighting Louis XIV. And certainly the battles in 1690 in Ireland, a lot of William's troops are the very same French Protestants kicked out of France, and they're fighting against French Catholic troops. So the last battle of the Wars of Religion is probably the Battle of the Boyne, the French Wars of Religion. So there's a strong background where the motivations of the major players don't involve England. England's more of a resource than a decision maker. Within England, there is a strong idea, I think, that they can put limits on people. They can try new constitutional methods. And I think that probably makes it clear that there's some way of getting rid of the king. Certainly the idea of anyone having the authority to invite another ruler onto the throne is an interesting one. It is as much an invasion as it is an invitation. You know, William lands with troops just down the coast from here. But that idea of parliamentary sovereignty has clearly not gone away, at least in defense of religious and political. It's difficult to separate the two principles. Yeah. So yeah, it sets the framework, and I don't know if there's a lot of learning from mistakes. You could certainly say that there probably is.
Well, they've got a nice past of things that went wrong that they can look to as a warning.
And they came so close to putting restrictions on Charles II in 1660, 59 really. That almost happened. So they were clearly thinking about it even then. So it might just be that a few more months to think about it in 1559 would have created a similar setup. But certainly they avoided making a similar sort of mistake, I guess. So the sort of Whiggish idea of that it all grows from that is probably overstated, but they do, there's clearly a strong connection. It's a lot of the same people they're still about.
I think we've come sort of to a natural drawdown.
Yeah.
As I want to say, thanks very much for your time.
No worries.
I think I would talk to your colleague as well, but this as a standalone, I think it's a great thing.
Sure. I really, and again on the record even, suggest talking to Elaine, because there are maybe a couple dozen, but probably not even that, people who have more familiarity with the Cromwell documents. So whereas a lot of what I've said is big sweep stuff and reminding you about, you know, the contingency of all of this and how it didn't have to happen the way that it did, that there wasn't necessarily a plan, Elaine can take you hour by hour through some of the decision making here, which may cast a different and more useful light on it. Yeah. Where I mentioned the levelers and how they tend to be concentrated in London, she can tell you exactly where and what background they come from, and cite some of the more interesting works to a level that I couldn't. Yeah. So you will get some very, you know, detail and facts and specificity, which are far more useful than opinions about the big picture. Yeah. Will come from her and not from me.
That would be great. I mean,
and if we conflict, you go with her version.
Absolutely. Yeah.